I ran because there was no other thing to do. Jack grabbed my sleeve and shoved me toward the main office, and I could hear my own heart like a drum in my ears. I pushed through a ring of phones and faces, and the smell of coffee and panic hit me hard, like stepping into a boiling room. Everyone was recording, whispering, and craning to see. My mom stood in the center, hands trembling but voice sharp, and Principal Reynolds had blood on his shirt where he clutched his nose, eyes wild and red. The secretary was on the phone with security, and the vice principal was saying, "Everyone calm down, please." But his voice kept breaking under the weight of what was being said. I felt the heat of embarrassment first, like a punch, then it flipped into something colder and bigger when my mom pulled up her phone and said, "He put cameras in the girls' locker rooms." The words fell into the room and everything slowed. I watched faces change like lights switching off. Teachers went from polite to sick in the span of a breath, and a handful of students dropped their phones as if dropping them could change anything. I heard someone stammer, "No way," and another kid whisper, "That can't be real." My mom didn't wait for disbelief. She began to talk fast, like she'd been rehearsing for days while we all pretended nothing was wrong. "Sophia found a lens behind a vent," she said, voice low and steady. "Her parents called me. I traced the feed. It goes to his office." She swiped her finger and brought up a purchase history on the screen, the tiny thumbnails of wireless cameras stamped with dates from months ago. Seeing the order confirmation in front of everyone felt like watching a trapdoor open under the principal's feet. Reynolds flailed, shouting, "This is slander. Someone hacked my system. This is impossible." His voice had the practiced outrage of a man who expected his reputation to be enough to stop the world from turning. The vice principal kept trying to smooth waves, saying, "Let's step back, we'll call law enforcement, but the room wouldn't step back. Too many people had already stepped into the truth. My mother tapped at receipts and server logs and kept explaining in plain sentences that even I, who barely understand half of what she does at work, could follow. Packet traces, IP addresses, and account login connected to Reynolds' school email. She showed the date and time stamps and the connection logs that tied the camera feeds to his office computer. Every time she said a technical detail in a simple way, the room grew quieter because people could see the logic lining up like a row of dominoes. I felt my stomach drop to my knees and go icy when she scrolled to messages and chat logs that were saved on the same server, messages where usernames discussed access and paid subscribers asked for certain times or angles. There were transaction records too, small amounts paid repeatedly, a pattern that suggested this had been going on for months. I couldn't stop looking at the numbers, micro payments that added up to something too big to ignore. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Oh my God," and then another voice said, "How many of our girls?" I thought of Sophia looking at me in the hallway last week. I thought of all the times people changed in that locker room and laughed about dumb things. The thought of it being anything else besides a crime made me want to throw up. Reynolds kept denying and stammering and trying to grab at anything that looked like an excuse, but then my mom held the phone steady and said, "Here's the purchase history logged into your account. Here's the server route. Here are the payments." She looked right at him and added, "You built this. You sold access." There was a moment then when his face lost color and his hands stopped moving. The secretary had already finished the call with security, and I could see two guards through the glass, waiting like storm clouds. The vice principal tried to say, "Please, we'll handle this internally," but my mom cut him off with a look that made his mouth shut. "You couldn't handle this internally. No one could fix this with a memo or an apology." Phones kept pointing, people kept filming, and for a second I felt like the whole universe was watching the moment a shield was stripped off someone everyone had trusted. I wanted to pull my mom away and tell her to stop. That truth could be handled in private, but she had the look of someone who had already seen too many private things go wrong and knew she had to make it public. My hands were clammy and my voice was small when I asked, "What happens now?" My mom answered without looking at me, "We get detectives, we preserve evidence, we make sure no one can erase anything." Her words were practical, steady, not comforting, but necessary. The room held its breath, and for the first time since we stepped in, it felt like something outside us was finally noticing. I'm a man who still feels like a kid in that hallway, and when Mr. Ortiz lost it, I heard the sound before I saw the move, a hard slam against the wall that made the trophy case rattle like loose change. He'd been pacing, red in the face, hands like fists, and then he grabbed Reynolds by the collar and pushed him up against the plaster like he'd been holding back a storm too long. "How many times did you think you could get away with this?" Mr. Ortiz screamed, his voice raw and shaking, and the whole crowd jolted because no one had expected a teacher to turn into an avenger right there in the office. Kids were screaming, phones rose up like a sea of tiny mirrors, and I felt my chest tighten because everything felt unglued. Mr. Ortiz kept shouting about vents and noises, about girls who'd complained and been brushed off, and he accused Reynolds of ignoring complaints that should have ended this a long time ago. "You heard them, you saw the vents," he yelled, jabbing a finger at Reynolds that trembled. The principal was pushed up against the wall, his face waxy, trying to get out a protest that sounded smaller than before. "That's a lie," Reynolds stammered, but the words didn't carry. Teachers who had stood frozen minutes before were now 2 steps away, like people who had watched a car crash and suddenly wanted to help the driver out. I wanted to step between them and pull Mr. Ortiz back to stop the violence from getting worse, but my feet felt stuck in the sticky tile. It took 3 security officers to pull Mr. Ortiz off Reynolds, and I remember the metallic smell of someone's fear and the scrape of shoes as they shoved him back. One officer gripped Ortiz's arm and said quietly, "Sir, you need to calm down, stand down," like he was trying to talk a friend off a ledge. Ortiz kept spitting words even as they held him back, saying things about reports ignored and students betrayed. When they finally eased him away, you could see every muscle in his face slowly unclench, like a wound being held closed by force. Students started shouting questions and teachers tried to herd them out, but the hallway had already turned into a crowd that didn't know whether to run or stay. The sirens were close, a rising scream that seemed to vibrate through everyone's teeth, and then police pushed through the doorway like a wave that cleared a beach. Officers moved fast and calm, forming a line to separate people into groups, asking for statements and keeping phones pointed down. The contrast between the shouting and the officers' quiet orders made the room feel smaller and sharper, like the moment when thunder makes everything press down. I watched as one officer took charge, his voice steady. "Everyone back, move along please, we need the area secured." People moved, some crying, some angry, some numb, and a teacher said, "Get them out of the building," like it was the only sensible thing left to do. Detective Marcus Hayes showed up minutes later with an authority that didn't yell but made people listen anyway. He had that look of someone who has seen too many things he didn't want to, and he stepped forward and said, "This is a crime scene now. We're putting tape across the room and no one goes in without me." He handed an officer tape and they wrapped Reynolds' office in a yellow line that suddenly made the whole place look like something serious had fallen apart. People stayed back, phones down for once, watching as the detective coordinated officers and told school staff to start writing statements. He asked my mom and me to come with him to a quieter room, and I remember how my mom's jaw set like iron when he spoke. Before we moved, the vice principal tried to talk to the crowd, to explain that law enforcement would handle things and that students should go home, but his voice kept getting swallowed by questions and murmurs. A kid near me shouted, "What about the girls?" And another teenager asked if parents had been notified yet. Teachers started moving through the hallway with clipboards, writing names and phone numbers as if building a list could turn the chaos into a plan. I felt the world tilt between panic and action, like people were scrambling to make sense of an ugly truth by making lists and taking names. My mom squeezed my arm once, hard but not nervous, and said in a low voice, "Stay with me." I told her I was fine though my stomach felt like a stone, and she looked at me like she knew I was lying. Detective Hayes guided us down a side corridor to a small office with bad fluorescent lights and a folding table. He asked questions in quick, careful sentences. What we knew when we found it, who saw what. I told him about Sophia finding the lens and my mom tracing the feed, and how Mr. Ortiz had been trying to warn people. Hayes scribbled notes and didn't look surprised, just tense like the calm before a long, hard storm. Outside, through a window, I could see students being shepherded into buses and cars, faces under hands, and the yellow tape fluttering in the wind like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. They put Reynolds in cuffs right there in front of us, and kids kept filming like it was a show while he shuffled out to the patrol car, head down and mouth moving, but no one could hear him over the phones. I watched him walk past and felt something hollow open in my chest, like the world had taken a hard breath and didn't know if it would let it out. Someone near me hissed, "That's him," and I could hear other kids cheering and crying at the same time. I wanted to hate him, and part of me already did, but mostly I felt raw and stunned, like a hand had taken something small and private and crushed it. The officer locked the door and the car drove away with sirens off, like the town had exhaled a weight and left a hole where trust used to be. Detective Marcus Hayes asked my mom and me to go to the station so we could give formal statements and preserve anything else that might matter. In the car, my mom didn't look like she had slept in days. Her eyes had that wired, tired look of someone who'd been living in front of a glowing screen and drinking bad coffee. She reached over and squeezed my hand and said quietly, "I want you to know everything that happened from start to finish." I wanted to hear it in small pieces like a bedtime story, but she told it in the steady, compressed way she always does when she's been working out a problem in her head. Clear, technical, and not letting emotions soften the edges. Sophia texted her parents about the vent camera after practice, my mom said, voice low enough that I could only half hear it, like she was telling a private thing out loud to make it real. "They called me because they know I work in IT. I told them to send me photos and not to touch anything." Sophia sent a picture of a small lens behind a vent grill, the kind of lens that blends into metal. I asked them to bring me the phone and a time-stamped video if they could get one. I remember thinking how small and stupid the camera looked in the photo, and how that small thing sat in the same place where kids change and laugh and tell secrets. She kept going. I pulled a packet capture of the device's traffic, and from there I followed the stream back to a private server on the school network. The server was set up to receive feeds and forward them to subscribers. I found logs that showed connection attempts and timestamps. Then I recovered deleted entries from the server after we suspected someone tried to scrub history. She explained the recovery like she was naming ingredients in a recipe, and I could almost picture the files coming back from the void. Some entries were wiped, but not everything. Deleted logs often leave traces. I dug through the raw data until I found the origin, an account tied to Reynolds's workstation, authenticated during shifts when he was on campus. I asked how she knew it wasn't a setup, some clever hack by a kid or a spiteful staff member trying to ruin someone's life. She shook her head hard. There were purchase receipts, she said, invoices tied to Reynolds's school procurement account, and a few personal transactions that matched small subscription payments. The server had directories labeled in a way that suggested whoever ran it expected to sell access. I found payment records, dozens of microtransactions that add up, coming from different parts of the country. Some accounts used anonymizing services, but the money trail was there. Once you have both the receipts and the server logs, you don't have a rumor, you have a chain. Her phone buzzed with messages from detectives as she talked, and she ignored it like nothing would make this move faster than what she was already doing. I took copies of everything and gave them to Hayes last night, she said, so he could start working with cyber units. I wanted the files in multiple places so no one could overwrite them. We also talked to witnesses and preserved the physical evidence. That's why I made a big scene, to make sure it ended up in public view where it couldn't be hidden again. I could tell she'd thought about every step, about how easily a corrupt system could erase a life if evidence stayed private. Detective Hayes nodded while she spoke and asked short questions about times and names and how the logs connected to the purchases. He didn't look surprised, just focused, like someone who had seen this pattern before but still needed every small fact put into order. He asked about the payments and foreign IPs and whether my mom had traced the buyer accounts to other users. She answered that she had, and that the pattern suggested a subscription network with tiers and private requests. He folded his hands and said, "This is bigger than one school. We'll bring in federal cyber agents." Hearing that made my stomach drop into my shoes, because bigger meant more people hurt and more fingers needing to point. On the ride into the station, I tried to make sense of it like a math problem, little camera, cable, server, invoices, payments, but the equation had people names stuck to it. Sophia, girls who never reported, staff who'd watched and been told to keep quiet. I felt both proud and terrified of my mom. Proud because she had chased down the threads that mattered, and terrified because I knew what following a wire like that does. It pulls you toward ugly truths you can't undo. Detective Hayes parked and led us inside, and as we walked down the hallway, I kept thinking the same thing over and over. Someone watched where our kids were supposed to be safe, and now we had to make sure they couldn't watch ever again. They brought us into a small room, and the first thing I noticed was the quiet, the sort of quiet that means people are doing work and there's no room for small talk. FBI agents sat with laptops open, and the cyber team had that look of people who read code the way others read newspapers. One of them said, "We need copies of everything you found," like it was obvious and urgent. My mom handed over drives and screenshots, her hands steady even though I could tell she was running on nothing. I felt like I was watching her move through a map she'd already memorized. And I wanted to say thank you in a million different ways, but only managed a small, useless smile. An agent named Ramirez scrolled through chat logs and payment sheets and said, "Tiered subscriptions, premium requests, offshore usernames." He read the words out like a list that should never exist in real life. Another agent blinked at a spreadsheet and said, "Look at these timestamps matching school periods." They pointed at screens, calling out patterns and cross-referencing IP addresses. I could see how the pieces fit together on their monitors, like a crime show but with real stakes and real people attached. Every time my mom clarified a term or handed over another snippet of recovered data, the agents leaned in like they'd just been handed the next important page in a book they needed to finish. The forensics team worked through our living room that night in a way I still can't shake. They came in with gray kits and carefully copied hard drives, phones, and the router logs. I watched them lift things out of my life, my mom's laptop, a USB drive, a notepad with scribbled times, and make perfect digital twins of them. One tech explained, "Deleted doesn't mean gone. We can usually pull remnants." He set a thumb drive into a machine, and within minutes a deleted chat message popped up on a screen like a ghost. My mom didn't look surprised. She told them where to look. I could tell she was fighting to stay professional, to keep a distance from the files she'd recovered, because they weren't just code and logs, they were proof of people stealing privacy. An agent kept repeating the same thing like a mantra. We're lucky she found this. It felt strange to hear luck attached to an awful discovery, but I understood what he meant. If my mom hadn't traced the feed, if Sophia hadn't found the lens, the evidence could have been gone or too muddled to prosecute. That idea sat heavy. Luck had saved us from a future with less justice and more hidden harm. News of what she'd pulled together seemed to lift the whole investigation from a messy rumor to a chain of facts investigators could follow. The agents worked with a focused, quiet urgency, mapping subscribers and tracing payments through layers of anonymizers and offshore accounts. By dawn, the school looked like the scene of something too large for one town to handle. News vans lined the street and cameras pointed at the building like hungry eyes. Reporters called and my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors and people I hadn't seen since middle school. I didn't answer most of them. The house felt small, like a pocket someone had turned inside out. The superintendent called an emergency assembly at school and the auditorium smelled like a held breath. He stood on the stage under a single light and promised counseling and cooperation with law enforcement, using plain words that tried to patch a raw place. We will do everything we can to support our students and help the investigation, he said, voice steady but thin. Hearing that, I thought of the girls in the locker rooms and wondered how words could match the size of what had been done. Counselors set up a table in the library by mid-morning, and families crowded it with questions and worried faces. Ms. Rivera, the counselor, organized a space for students to talk, and she kept saying, "We're here for you," like she was trying to stitch safety back together with small human stitches. Parents demanded answers. Some students cried openly. Others sat still like statues you could almost see thinking. The FBI worked with school staff to manage interviews and preserve other systems, and detectives moved through classrooms asking quiet, careful questions. The rhythm of the day turned into a long list of tasks: interviews, evidence processing, counseling, and public statements. Through it all, my mom stayed at the center of it, often hunched over keyboards and papers and laptop screens, explaining technical details to agents who then turned them into warrants and arrests. She spoke plainly to reporters when they asked, saying, "We found a feed, we traced it, and we preserved evidence." Those short sentences seemed to calm some people and anger others, but mostly they gave facts to a story that had been swirling in rumor. By evening, the FBI had widened the investigation, and county and federal resources were on the case. I walked past the yellow tape outside the school and thought about how a small lens behind a vent changed a whole town. I felt a fierce, quiet gratitude for my mom because she turned a discovery into action and because she made sure the story didn't get buried under fear. She texted me 2 words that landed like a punch: "I feel dirty." Those words were small and clear, and they cut deeper than the anger or the shock. I wanted to answer with something steady, something to hold her, but she needed space and distance, and that need felt like another wound. I kept her message open on my screen for a long time, rereading it like maybe a second read would give me the right words. My thumb hovered over the keyboard and I typed, "I'm here," then deleted it, then typed, "Take whatever time you need," and finally sent that. It felt useless and not useless at the same time. The way she pulled away hurt more than any headline or courtroom drama ever could. The investigation kept changing shape around us like a weather front moving in. Detectives found that subscribers could request specific girls, specific angles, and certain time ranges, which made the whole thing worse in ways that were hard to say out loud. An agent told us quietly there were tiers, basic, premium, custom requests. Hearing those words made it feel like the cameras weren't just creepy tools but a market, and places where kids changed became products on a hidden shelf. Parents started pulling their children out of school the next day, wary and furious. And the hallways that used to be loud with gossip and homework felt thin and empty in places where names were missing. More students came forward with stories that added ugly pieces to the puzzle. Missing items from lockers, backpacks left open, a towel gone after practice, a gym locker that smelled wrong. One girl told a counselor that she'd found a hair tie lodged in a vent and assumed it had come from something else, not a camera. Each new account made the list longer and the town feels smaller with every name. Counselors tried to help, and Ms. Rivera set up group sessions, but some wounds were private in a way words couldn't reach. Kids who had once loved practice stopped showing up. Coaches looked like they were carrying the weight of responsibility and the suspicion of having missed signs. Then emails started leaking. Someone, maybe an angry employee, maybe a parent with copies, let loose messages that showed the school board had advised staff to avoid scandal, to manage complaints internally, and to protect the district's image. Reading those lines felt like cold water. Teachers who had tried to raise concerns were told to be quiet or else. At a staff meeting, a teacher shared an email that said, "We need to avoid reputational damage, handle quietly," and people in the room went white. The gym coach who'd accused Reynolds earlier had notes showing his warnings were dismissed. When we learned that, what had felt like isolated failure turned into something systemic, and it fed a rage that was louder than grief. The parent meeting at the town center was packed in a way I hadn't seen since a high school playoff game. People stood shoulder to shoulder and the room smelled like stress and too much coffee. The superintendent tried to speak with phrases like cooperation and full transparency, but his words didn't land. A mother shouted, "Who covered this up?" And another parent demanded, "Why weren't we told sooner?" That line of angry voices grew until it became a roar, and then it split into shouted accusations, legal threats, and frantic pleas for answers. Board members tried to explain, but every sentence seemed to make someone angrier. The meeting devolved into shouting matches about lawsuits, responsibility, and what the school had done to protect students. By the end of the night, some board members resigned, slipping out the back door like people whose names had become too hot to carry. Their departures felt like a hollowing out, a way for some to escape the storm while the rest of us stayed to look through the wreckage. Lawyers began calling, and a stack of potential suits started forming on the superintendent's desk. Parents compared notes and evidence, forming private groups to share what they knew. One father said aloud, "We can't trust them to keep our kids safe." And a quiet, terrible consensus grew that trust had been broken in a way that would not be fixed by words. The town's normal routines began to fray. Practices moved, schedules changed, and the school installed extra locks and signs about privacy. There were meetings about policy, about anonymous reporting, and about audits that would take months. Even with those moves, the air felt different. People walked a little slower in public and watched events with a new suspicion. I found myself staring at the gym door in a way that made me dizzy, thinking about how something small and hidden could ruin so much. I kept replaying Sophia's text in my head and felt the ache of her distance every time my phone buzzed with another update. The fallout was spreading outward like a stain, and I knew this was only the beginning of how deep it would cut into people's lives. Detectives followed the money like a dog on a scent, and what they found made my stomach drop all over again. The procurement lines for the school had been used like a secret wallet. Paperwork showed purchases labeled as equipment and maintenance that were anything but. I remember an investigator saying he funneled funds through small vendor accounts, like it was a dry fact, but it meant textbooks and supplies were short so cameras could show kids without anyone knowing. When the finance guy from the district sat down with detectives, he looked like someone caught in a storm. He flipped through purchase orders and invoices and said, "These were approved through Reynolds' sign-off." The words hit like a slap. Embezzlement charges were added to the list, and suddenly this was not just a local scandal but a criminal web that touched budgets, vendors, and contract approvals. People who had trusted numbers and checks felt betrayed. The math didn't lie, and the paper trail had Reynolds' handprint all over it. Once the financial crimes team dug in, the case grew teeth. It pulled in neighboring counties and federal agents because money moved across state lines and servers pinged international addresses. I heard Detective Hayes on the phone say, "We'll need multi-jurisdictional warrants," and I remember thinking how a small camera could pull so many hands into one mess. Arrests started happening outside our town, a teacher in another state, a youth coach in a nearby county, even a daycare worker who'd paid for access. Each arrest felt like another confirmation that the problem wasn't a single rotten apple but a rotten barrel. The international side hit different. IP addresses traced to other countries led to cooperative work with foreign law enforcement. I watched news clips of police in different places taking people in, and the scale of it shut my throat. They were buying subscriptions and requesting times, an FBI agent told a reporter, and the reporter framed it like a business model for sick people. The deeper the investigation went, the more it felt like someone had opened a map that showed dots lighting up all over the place. Each dot a story of someone violated. Trials came after months of evidence collection, and the courtroom felt heavy with voices that had been muffled for too long. Prosecutors laid out chats, payments, and server logs, and defense lawyers tried to push it back into gray. I sat in the gallery with my mom, and she held a folder of printouts like talismans. One by one, several subscribers were convicted and given long sentences. I remember a juror saying, "We couldn't ignore the pattern," and a judge reading sentences that made some of the guilty look smaller than they had when they walked into court. My mom's role was a constant through all of it. Agents kept telling anyone who would listen that her work had made the case prosecutable. "Without her, we don't have a chain," an FBI agent told a reporter, and the phrase followed her for months. Tech companies started calling with job offers, people wanting her skill to build systems that could catch hidden devices or suspicious network traffic. She got emails with titles like Lead Cyber Analyst and Build Our Detection Team, and I could tell she was tired but also recognizing that this could change her life and help other towns. People in our town tried to pick up the pieces in different ways. The district rewrote procurement policies, added checks on purchases, and installed better auditing. Schools nationwide added stricter background checks and network monitoring that could flag odd devices. Survivors found support groups and some began to tell their stories publicly. It didn't fix what happened, but it stopped some things from being easy for predators in the future. I applied to college thinking about cybersecurity and how one small camera had rerouted my life toward preventing harm. Even as convictions happened and arrests were made overseas, the cleanup kept going. Investigators still requested logs and followed up on leads months later. For my mom, the phone calls from companies were both an opportunity and a reminder. She had been the person who pulled a thread and watched the whole rotten sweater come apart. I felt proud and small at the same time, proud because she got justice started, small because I knew there were places where luck hadn't found the trail. The town changed, laws changed, and for a lot of people the scars stayed, but the work she did meant fewer places for predators to hide. Things started to change because people refused to let the story die. The first change I noticed was new cameras, big, visible ones in hallways and by locker rooms, not hidden ones that could be slipped into a vent. They put up signs that said the buildings were monitored and that privacy mattered. I remember walking past one and thinking, finally, like it was a small, practical promise. The district set up anonymous reporting boxes in every school wing, and counselors told us those boxes would be checked daily so students could say what they knew without fear. It felt like somebody finally heard the part where adults had failed to listen before. They implemented mandatory background checks every 2 years for all staff, and that rule stuck like a guardrail. No more shortcuts or trusting reputation alone. HR had to run clearances and update them regularly. I watched the district board roll out training sessions where they taught staff how to recognize unusual behavior and how to report it. They also added protections for staff who blew the whistle, legal support and job security so people wouldn't be punished for trying to protect kids. One teacher leaned over and said, "This should have been in place long ago." And I thought about how many warnings had been ignored because the system rewarded silence. The gym coach, Mr. Ortiz, was a whole other story. For weeks he was treated like the villain by people who only saw him lose his temper. Then leaked emails and internal notes showed he had tried to report complaints about vents and odd noises months earlier and been told to stop. The board put him through a full review and finally cleared him after evidence proved he'd raised concerns and been shut down. When he walked back into the gym, kids who had watched him get dragged through rumors stood and clapped. He didn't smile like someone who'd want to fight, he looked like someone who'd been given back a piece of a life. "They almost broke me," he said to me later, voice flat, "but I kept the notes." His persistence was proof that sometimes doing the right thing means bashing your head against bad systems until they crack. The library became a different place, one that smelled like old books but also like work. Counselors set up a crisis center and the room filled with kids seeking help. Some just sat quietly while others spoke. Ms. Rivera and a team of counselors worked days and nights to manage the flow, running group sessions and private meetings. Survivors formed support groups that met twice a week, swapping stories and practical ways to cope. One night I listened as a young woman said, "I stopped going to practice because I was scared." And the room leaned in like every person there wanted to hold that fear and make it smaller. Sophia started therapy and her return to school was careful and slow. The first week she came back, she sat in the front row of gym class and left 5 minutes early. She texted me, "I don't know if this will get easier," and I told her, "Take it on your terms." Over months she grew stronger in small steps. A practice here, a friendly conversation there, until she played in a scrimmage and didn't leave halfway through. Seeing her back on the court felt like a small triumph, not because everything was fixed, but because she chose to reclaim some normalcy. I didn't sit out either. A group of students and I organized meetings in the cafeteria and drafted letters demanding resignations from board members who'd covered things up. We held signs that said, "Safety over optics," and we pushed for real policy changes instead of PR statements. Hundreds of students marched to the district office with chants and banners and a list of clear demands: independent audits, public reporting of complaints, and faster action on suspicious behavior. "Listen to us," we shouted outside the glass doors, and parents and teachers stood along the sidewalk, some crying, some nodding. The march lasted hours, but it mattered. Board members who had avoided the town's anger had to face parents and students in person. They promised reforms and hired outside auditors to check purchasing and reporting practices. Some resigned when their inaction was exposed, and new members were elected who'd run on transparency. It wasn't perfect, and a lot of people wanted more than promises, but the momentum forced change that might otherwise have been delayed. In classes after the protests, people talked differently about safety and responsibility, like new rules had moved from the bulletin board into real life. My mom kept working with agencies to improve detection systems and help draft guidelines schools across the state started using. I kept studying cybersecurity because this felt like a life I could give to other people, a way to make sure cameras were used for protection and not for harm. The town felt raw and tired, but also more awake. We had scars, and we had work still to do, but for the first time since that tiny lens was found, I felt like we were building something that might actually stop someone else from getting hurt. A year later felt both long and strangely fast, like a season you remember by a few clear, raw moments. Reynolds pled guilty in a courtroom that still smelled like coffee and legal paper, and watching him stand and say the words out loud made something in the room shift. The judge read the charges and the sentence, and someone in the back sobbed like they had been holding it for a year. I sat next to my mom with a folder of copies and felt proud and empty at the same time. Proud that the case had reached a verdict, empty because no verdict brings everything back. After court, the town tried to mark the thing that had happened in a way that would hold memory and not leave the hurt to rot alone. We planted a memorial garden behind the gym where softball used to echo across summer evenings. People brought stones and handwritten notes and little things that meant safety to them: a worn baseball glove, a ribbon, a photograph. Survivors and families planted perennials and laid mulch with gloved hands, and the ground looked cleaner when we finished, like a place meant for healing instead of secrecy. Ms. Rivera stood by and said, "We'll keep watering it," and that small, literal work felt like a promise. Graduation came with a kind of quiet electricity. Sophia was asked to speak because for many she had become the face of getting through the worst parts. When she walked to the microphone, she didn't look like someone who had been broken. She looked like someone who'd been remade step by step. "This didn't end me," she said, voice steady but soft, and the crowd leaned in like they needed every sentence. "I am here because I chose healing. I am here for those who couldn't stand yet." Her speech was simple, full of the small truths that matter most. We keep each other safe. We are louder than the shame. People clapped until their hands were sore, and I felt tears I hadn't planned. My mom's work moved from our living room into systems other people paid for. The detection software she'd built, the tool that helped trace streams and detect hidden devices, was adopted by districts across the state after pilot programs showed it could flag suspicious network traffic and unknown cameras. She had offers from companies with big logos and from nonprofits who wanted to put tools in schools for free. In meetings, she'd say, "We need systems that don't assume adults will always do the right thing," and people would nod because they had seen why systems matter. Her code was no longer just files on a drive. It was a shield other towns could use. I enrolled in college for cybersecurity in the fall, choosing a path shaped by one small lens and a lot of anger turned purposeful. On campus, I told people the short version of the story and watched their faces change from curiosity to something like resolve. Classes felt like training now, not just learning, networks, forensics, ethical hacking, all tools to keep others safe. My mom sent me care packages with instant ramen and little notes that said, "Use this for the long nights." And I laughed every time because it was exactly what I needed. The pain never fully left. There are nights when a vent in a locker room will catch my eye and a memory flips on. There are moments when a headline about another town makes my stomach drop and I have to breathe until it passes. But alongside that pain was something that grew into work and rules and a network of people who would not let predators slip through. Prosecutors kept pursuing subscribers in other states, and some of the more egregious offenders received long sentences that matched the harm they'd done. Policies changed in schools and district audits became normal instead of suspicious. Support groups kept meeting in the same library that had become a crisis center, and survivors stayed connected, passing on resources and checking in when anniversaries rolled around. A few girls went on to study law or social work, and they said they wanted to change systems from inside. Watching that made me feel like we had seeded something that could multiply, something real growing from terrible soil. Sometimes friends ask if vengeance or justice felt the same, and I tell them, justice is paperwork in a sentence, healing is quieter and slower. My mom used that duality as fuel for her work, and I used it as fuel for mine. We still live with scars, events you don't forget, but we also live with new routines designed to stop that kind of harm before it starts. That became my purpose, to take the worst thing that happened to us and build armor for kids who don't yet know they need it. I study, I listen, and I keep pushing for tools and policies that make schools safer. It doesn't erase the hurt, but it makes sure fewer children will ever say, "I feel dirty," and have to mean it.